Greetings, parental slave masters. I am Patrick Smith. Welcome back to Disenthrall. So a thing happened recently. Somebody at Harvard put out an article literally calling for almost a complete end to your parental rights when it comes to the education of your children. And that cannot stand. And so this episode today is going to be me and our special guest, who I recently also had the pleasure of interviewing on Anarchast, Corey DeAngelis, and I got your name right this time. Boom. Welcome to the show. Corey is the director of school choice at the Reason Foundation, an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute, the executive director at the Educational Freedom Institute, holds a PhD in education policy, has authored over 40 articles and reports, and has been published in so many peer-reviewed journals and outlets that I'm not even going to list them. Welcome to the show, Corey.
Hey, Patrick. Thanks for having me. It's good to talk to you again.
It is good. I am excited about this, and I have a feeling that this is going to be the perfect dynamic. You are the scholarly source of information that is going to rebut this lady, and I am the activist parent that is going to rage all over the screen because this makes me angry. So we might have like a Jekyll and Hyde dynamic, but this lady, Elizabeth Bartholet, is the Morris Wasserstein Public Interest Professor at the professor of law at Harvard Law School, faculty director of Harvard Law School's Child Advocacy Program. She teaches civil rights and family law as if she knows anything about either, specializing in child welfare, adoption, and reproductive technology. And I always try and show the faces of the people that we talk to, because I think it's important that if she's going to say this fascistic nonsense in this article we're about to get into, that people need to be able to see who's wanting their life and their children controlled. See, I'm already getting hot, man. I'm sorry.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is the face of the person who's calling for a presumptive ban on the practice of homeschooling. And, you know, her main argument is that parents aren't smart enough to be able to homeschool their kids, or that they're going to be just using homeschooling as an outlet to abuse their kids. I mean, it's a completely ridiculous take and negative view and dark view of homeschoolers. And again, I mean, she paints with a very broad brush throughout the article and elsewhere, and tries to just make homeschoolers out to be evil people. But in reality, homeschoolers are, they tend to fare better academically and socially than their otherwise similar peers in the government school system. And children in the home tend to be abused at lower rates than they do in government-run schools. So, I mean, we'll get into all this in a second, but I mean, her reasoning is completely ridiculous. And what's even more ridiculous is just the policy that she recommends of a presumptive ban on the practice of homeschooling.
And what adds fury to insult for me is that she couches the article in terms of protecting children, as all good lefties do when they want to institute government controls. It's for somebody's protection. So think of the children, and she knows how to best take care of your children. You don't know how to take care of your children, right? I mean, that's the idea here, that she's some smarty pants at Harvard Law School, and her thinking is that, well, you should have to ask her for permission to homeschool your kids if and prove yourself worthy of homeschooling your own children to either her or other government bureaucrats. Which, I mean, that's completely ridiculous. These aren't her children. These are your own children. And, if families are doing something, unacceptable with their children, I'll just first point out that no one here, no one on the side of homeschooling freedom is calling for absolute parental rights. If there's evidence of wrongdoing going on in the home, then perhaps there is room for intervention, either from a government official in the day and age that we live in today, or even in an anarchist society, perhaps a private provider of security services would then have the legitimacy to come in and intervene if there is instances of abuse. But I mean, the whole logic of Bartholet's argument is that we should all be guilty until proven innocent. And that's completely backwards. I mean, we are all rightly innocent until proven guilty.
Well, let's get into it. Good to have you, Frontal, Corey, Joseph, Mark. You guys are great in the comments. Thanks for joining us. Okay, so like a headline I saw about this lady in her article literally says that, Harvard professor calls homeschooling dangerous, says it gives parents authoritarian control over kids. That's the Orwellian, backwards doublespeak I'm talking about. Homeschooling gives parents authoritarian control over their kids. So her solution? Well, let's have some authoritarian control over your kids.
That's just beyond parody that she doesn't recognize what she's saying, right? Like, she's saying that homeschooling is authoritarian. Then she turns around and calls for a presumptive ban on homeschooling, which is by definition true authoritarianism. So you're completely right. That's just completely ridiculous that she actually can, with a straight face, say these two things at the same time.
No self-awareness. So I don't know how to dissect this best. And so maybe you're welcome to give me direction or to jump around or whatever. But
we can start with the title. The title, this is 80 pages, but the issues start with the title itself. And it's pretty embarrassing that something like this went through the peer review process and got published in an quote unquote academic outlet when the whole thing is built on a straw man argument. And, if you are a legitimate scholar, you shouldn't be arguing against a straw man. But here you go in the title: Homeschooling, Parent Rights Absolutism versus Child Rights. No one's calling for absolutism with parental rights. As I said a second ago, no one on the side of educational freedom is saying that parents shouldn't be able to injure their kids or abuse their kids or to not teach them anything whatsoever. No one's saying that at all. So she starts off the article, setting up a straw man and trying to say that the people on the side of freedom are calling for parental rights absolutism. No one's doing that.
Yeah, and I forgot to mention the background that I'm using here today is one that nobody's seen yet. This is actually the rendered background that I'm using for Peaceful Parenting University, a project that I'm starting to teach parents how to fill their toolbox with the tools needed to learn how to parent peacefully as opposed to the historically, forceful way. And so I just thought it was appropriate to have that as our background for the show today. You can find more information about that project at peacefulparentinguniversity.com. Okay, so this is an 80-page article, but I think most of it is summarized in the introduction. So if you think it's a good idea, I would like to read 8 or 10 paragraphs out of the introduction and just dissect them as we go, unless you have maybe a better way of doing it.
Yeah, whatever you want to do. But the first thing I see in this, anybody looking at this paragraph right here in the abstract, the word many keeps popping out.
Oh, well, let's do that. Let's pull up. I have the PDF here. So this is the whole thing here. We can Control F.
Yeah, just do a Control F and count the number of times in this article that she says the word many or some.
Many is 90. And some.
Okay, now try some.
120. Yeah. Okay.
So you add those two up, you get 210 instances in an 80-page article of the word some or many. And that highlights the biggest problem, period, with this article, is that the whole 80-page article is just Elizabeth Bartholet using fear-mongering to say, oh, well, some homeschooling families may support the patriarchy, or many families are religious, but she doesn't back up her claims with any statistics. So if since she can just go through and say some families do this, if she can find just like 1 or 2 instances of someone saying that this has happened, she could essentially back up her claim, but she doesn't really cite any of this happening. She just says many or some, doesn't provide specific statistics on the percentage of homeschool families that are doing this or that or the other. And so essentially she uses extreme cases throughout this to generalize and fearmonger and to paint with a broad brush and to make the homeschool population look like something that it isn't. And, this highlights, your Control F with some or many popping up 210 times highlights the main problem here throughout the entire article.
And she cites one instance that's a book that she read by this lady that was clearly abused as a child, like almost basically held captive by her parents and sequestered from the world. And she basically talks about all homeschoolers like that, like they're all abusive, right-wing nut jobs that want to, indoctrinate their kids, which is what the public school system does. Like the Prussian school system was created with the express purpose of indoctrinating kids, training them to be a specific kind of human that will be beneficial to the war machine at the time. Who's indoctrinating who here? The people that don't want to subject their kids to that? Or you assholes that are running the system that was like expressly created for that purpose? What?
Yeah, I mean, it's just the type of indoctrination that she agrees with might be more likely to happen in the government school system. Maybe she's okay with people becoming factory workers, or maybe is okay with people growing up to worship the state instead of worshiping a god. I think that's the issue here, right? She doesn't like those conservative Christian people with their religious indoctrination. And I'll just be upfront really quick that I'm not a religious person myself, but I understand that everybody has the First Amendment right to freely exercise their religions, even if Elizabeth Bartholet doesn't like that fact, and even if a bunch of Ivy League elites at Harvard and other universities don't like the fact that there are religious people who are homeschooling. But yeah, look, I mean, the big issue here, again, as you pointed out, is she also doesn't really compare these instances of abuse. First of all, she doesn't even cite statistics, but she building off of that issue, also doesn't really contend with the reality that a lot of these things are also happening in the alternative to homeschooling, which is the government-run school system. So she can cite one person's account of abuse in the home, and that's obviously something that we don't want to ever happen to any individual. But then I can take the same methodology and say, oh, I'm going to interview one person who was sexually abused in the government school system. I can find tons of instances of that happening. There's actually a website. You can pull it up if you want, but you don't have to. There's a website. It's easy to type in. It's sexualabuseinschools.org. And they update this, like once a week, I think, with just instances of sexual abuse in government schools, throughout the United States.
What's the site again?
Sexualabuseinschools.org. And so if I use the same methodology and applied her same logic to the government school system, well, then we'd have to ban government schools too, right? I mean, if she's using one case and painting with a broad brush to the entire homeschooling population and calling for a presumptive ban on homeschooling, well, then we should be able to look at this website, do the same kind of methodology she's doing. I mean, this is a little more systematic because now we have a bunch of cases and we don't just say some or many. We can actually cite numbers here.
Sex assault, child porn, inappropriate conduct, sex abuse, sexual relationship, child sex crime, sexual assault, pled guilty to sexual abuse. We just got demonetized, but I don't care. Yes, good example.
Yeah, I'm like, God, I can't cover my ears, because the headphones are on. But I mean, the idea here is that based on her logic, we could just take that list and say, well, even though this isn't happening in all government schools, and we don't have evidence of it happening in all government schools, well, then we should close down all government schools and ban government schools too. But she doesn't really contend with that, because if she did, she would have had to apply her homeschooling ban to the government school system ban. And she doesn't want to do that. She doesn't want to apply the logic consistently. And I think that's another one of the big issues. And whenever she does bring up evidence regarding like comparing homeschooling to government schooling, she tries to discount all the positive evidence, and then she lifts up the negative evidence and pretty much just attacks the character of the researchers of the positive evidence. She just commits ad hominem fallacy throughout the whole. I mean, and you'll see it, in a little bit.
Let's get into it.
I mean, if you just do a Control F for Brian Ray, for example, you'll see it. And he's done a lot of the research finding that kids are abused at lower rates in the government schools, and that they're abused at lower rates in the home than in the government schools, and that Brian Ray's work. So, and he also finds, and many other scholars find, that homeschoolers tend to do better academically and socially than the kids in the government school system. So she goes through like a 2-page diatribe against Brian Ray, who's a great guy, but she just attacks his funding sources and I don't even know if she has specific funding sources or if she just theorizes about it, but she also attacks, she uses the term, you could search for this too, advocacy dressed up as social science, or advocacy dressed up as science. If you just look up advocacy dressed up, dressed up. She accuses Brian Ray essentially of, just being biased, and she's saying you can't really look at any Brian Ray's work or the positive evidence because it's Brian Ray. And I mean, that is textbook definition of ad hominem fallacy. She is only attacking the character. She's not really attacking the methods. She attacks one particular type of method of Ray's work, and what she says is, we don't really look at the entire population of homeschoolers, but any social scientist knows that that's far-fetched to expect a researcher to be able to look at the entire population of different groups. You usually get the statistics you can, you get the data points you can, and you analyze it to the best of your ability, and you note your limitations. But she's saying, well, he didn't observe the whole population, which is beyond, that's out of the realm of expectations of what you would see with most social science. It's usually, you try to get a representative sample and draw conclusions based off it. But she just tries to discount and throw away and discredit any positive evidence. But then she turns around, she says that about Brian Ray's study, and then she turns around and cites a pediatric study of only 28 abuse cases. And the authors themselves even say you cannot you should not perform statistical tests on these numbers. The authors themselves say, in quotes, this is not a representative sample by any means. But that doesn't stop Elizabeth Bartholet from turning around and using this small sample of 28 students, and then turning around in the Boston Globe a week or two ago and making the claim that there is evidence that children are abused in the home, in homeschool situations, more than they are in regular schools. And there's no way you can make that conclusion from that one study as stated by the authors themselves, but then also just by looking at the methods of the study. I mean, there's no way you can claim that they select on the dependent variable. It's kind of a statistical technical term, but it's essentially means it's worse than mere correlation. And we all know correlation isn't causation. But when you select on the dependent variable, any econometrician watching this would know that that's even worse than mere correlation. So it's nowhere near causal.
A Frontal in the comments says, by the way, the tactics she's using in this article are exactly what lawyers are trained to use and rely on in courtrooms. It did read very lawyerly. With that said, let me just read some of this. This is primarily from the introduction. It's kind of a summary of all the garbage inside. This article describes the rapidly growing homeschooling phenomenon and the threat it poses to children and society. Homeschooling activists have, in recent decades, largely succeeded in their deregulation campaign, overwhelming legislatures with aggressive advocacy. As a result, parents can now keep their children at home in the name of homeschooling, free from any real scrutiny as to whether or how they are educating their children. Many homeschool because they want to isolate their children from ideas and values central to our democracy. Yes, I do want to isolate and shelter my children from your idea, your values, and your democracy. Yes, and I'm allowed to. Yes, that's okay. I'm a parent. I exist. I do not consent to that garbage, and that's all that I need. Okay. All right. Breathe.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you look at the co-organizer of the conference that she was putting together that recently got canceled, James Dwyer, who co-organized the conference with Elizabeth, said something along the lines of the reason. Here's the quote: "The reason child-parent relationships exist is because the state confers legal parenthood." Essentially, what that means is that he thinks that your children belong to the government. Mm-hmm. You're only a parent because the government allows you to be the parent.
Many promote racial segregation and female subservience. Many question science. Abusive parents can keep their children at home free from the risk that teachers will report them to Child Protection Services. Yes, people keep their kids out of school because Child Protective Services destroys families, innocent families, all the time. Like, yes, sometimes they catch bad guys, but I don't want them in. I'm not a bad guy. I am a great parent. I work every day of my life to be a great parent, and I don't want those eyes anywhere near my family. And I have a right to not want that, and I have a right to keep that out of my family's life. This is how it's going to be. I'm going to yell, and he's going to be reasonable, I guess. That's fine.
I was frozen for a second.
No!
I was frozen for a second, but now I'm back.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, as you're reading this and as I'm looking at this, like, what if the abusers are in the government school system? What if it's the teachers, like we saw? I mean, the most recent Department of Education report on this was from 2004. It was quite a while ago, but they should do a new study if they want to update the numbers. But they found that 1 in every 10 kids who go through the government school system, they estimated that 1 in every 10 kids would experience educator sexual misconduct by the time those kids graduate from high school. So there's risk of abuse in the government school system with the teachers, but then also, I mean, that government report, the U.S. Department of Ed report, didn't even include any of the abuse by other students. So there's bullying, there's sexual abuse by other students, obviously, there's drugs, there's gang activities, there's violence at schools. So who's gonna help the kids avoid this kind of abuse that we actually do know and have statistics to support the fact that this abuse runs rampant in the government school system? I mean, 79% of government schools reported some types of crime in the most recent year. I mean, this, and we aren't even having to say many or some or that this might happen. We have hard statistics showing that this does happen, and I would argue that the statistics that we have are lower bounds of the true what actually truly happens, because a lot of the times this stuff goes unreported, right? A 2010 Government Accountability Office report estimated that, and on average, a teacher will go through 3 different school districts by the time that they are caught for sexual misconduct. They actually had a term for it called passing the trash, that they don't really mark them up for it. They'll just let them go silently, and then they won't have it on the record, so they get a job somewhere else. And so there's all this misreporting going on, and that same report estimated that one offender could have up to 73 victims in his or her lifetime. So I mean, and then also as you're reading through this with the many and the many promote racial segregation is the claim. It's like citation needed. I mean, the meme, like citation needed. Like, where's your citation for that? Like, what does many mean? Does that mean that 0.001% of the proportion of homeschool families are doing these things? Maybe. But you're not giving me any indication. Is many like 50% or is it 0.0001%? And, if it's like 0.1%, then, this, even if it was 0.1%, let's just say that's the amount. Does that mean that I shouldn't be able to educate my children at home when I'm doing nothing wrong? Should we punish 100% of people for the actions of 0.1% of people? That doesn't make any sense.
Here's a many and a some that she probably won't like. Many college professors are communists. Some of them are violent communists. Therefore, we need government control and oversight to watch what they say to make sure they're not being communist in our colleges. How about that many and that some? You like that? No.
She likes that. She likes the communist part, probably.
Oh. Okay.
They need more funding. They just need more funding to fix those problems.
It recommends so this article recommends a presumptive ban on homeschooling with the burden on parents to demonstrate justification for permission.
Ooh. For
permission to homeschool. Oh my God.
I mean, that's the worst part, right? I mean, it's the kids belong to the government, and if you want to educate your own kids at home, you got to go beg mommy, daddy government to allow you to be able to educate your own kids, which she thinks belong to the government essentially. at home. I mean, it's completely sick. And just imagine, I mean, this burden of proof falls harder on disadvantaged populations, obviously, right? I mean, people that may not have the means to maybe get a lawyer to be able to present this evidence and pay for a lawyer to be able to do that. So, I mean, her ban essentially could theoretically at least lead to, inequities with if you don't have the resources to be able to put that proof forward. But I mean, look, another issue is let's just apply this to other areas of life. I mean, the whole idea here, in her view, is that, well, if you have nothing to hide and you're a good parent, well, then you should be able to present that proof, right? And if you're giving them a good education, you're not abusing your kids, you should be able to have no worries about the government coming and checking on you. Is the theory that's put forth by Elizabeth Bartholet. But just if that's a good theory and if that justifies government intervention, then why start at the age of 5? What stops her from saying, okay, now let's do it at the age of 0. If it's such a good idea at the age of 5, why don't we give our kids to the government at age 0 because of potential abuse between the ages of 0 and 5? And then why stop at the age 18, right? If you're in a relationship, right, and relationships have the potential for abuse, it could happen, and it does happen. So based on her logic of the presumptive ban would be this idea, well, if you have nothing to hide with your relationship, then you should be all fine and dandy with paying for and going to a government counselor each week to prove your innocence and to prove that you have a healthy relationship. I mean, everybody would think that would be completely ridiculous, before the age of 5 and then after the age of 18 with our relationships. But then we can go on and on and on with other types of, we can essentially get rid of the Fourth Amendment, right? Because if you have nothing to hide, it shouldn't matter if the cops come in and check your stuff. If you don't have any drugs to hide or whatever. And if you don't have anything to hide, well, then why should you have the Fifth Amendment either?
Why do you need any of that freedom? If you're perfectly obedient to the government, you don't need freedom.
Yeah, I think there's so much issues with this logic. You can apply it to food too. We want kids to be healthy, and there is the potential that parents won't feed their children the best food. So does that mean that we need to punish 100% of families and say that, well, if you have nothing to hide, if you're feeding your kid broccoli every day, you should be more than happy to allow the government officials with guns to come into your house and watch you eat dinner at the dinner table each night? No, I think everybody would think that. Hopefully, most people would think that's absolutely lunacy. And, it's the same logic as to why we don't want a presumptive ban on homeschooling either. And the main idea is that we should not have to prove our innocence in this country. And, for the most part, our legal system is set up in a way where we don't have to prove our innocence. We are innocent until proven guilty, and rightly so. The burden of proof usually falls on the government to prove that we are guilty of something before they force us to be locked up in a cage, which is essentially, what happens with schools. If we had this presumptive ban, if you have a presumptive ban on homeschooling, you're essentially forcing families to send their kids to a government school each day. If they don't, for whatever reason, have the willpower or the money to be able to lobby, to be able to prove their innocence and to reason why they should be allowed to homeschool their own kids.
All right, let me read some more before I die. Homeschooling. Homeschooling is a realm of near absolute parental power. This power is inconsistent with important rights supposedly guaranteed to children under state constitutions and state legislation throughout the land, and it's inconsistent with a proper understanding of the human rights of children, one recognizing children as full human beings with interests entitled to the same value as adult interests. Parents have too much power. We want to have some. That's how I read that.
That's exactly it. Well, it's we don't want and obviously kids aren't property, but parents have the best interests of their kids in mind, way better interests in general than some random government bureaucrat or other individuals who aren't related to them. But this idea that she's putting forth is, it seems like a tug of war over who's the parent here, either the government or the actual parent. And she's essentially saying that, homeschooling denies kids rights to an education. No, it doesn't. I mean, homeschool kids get better educations, and it just might deny them from the type of education that you want them to have, which is, stuck in some factory model school that could be more likely to indoctrinate them in the types of indoctrination that you want.
Well said.
I won't guess what type of indoctrination that is, but I would think it's probably based on how she attacks Christians and conservatives in this article. Maybe she wants a left-leaning indoctrination that is likely to occur in the government school system. And I don't know if you want to look through that later or in a second, but
yeah, we can look through that.
I mean,
so first I got to shout out, I normally don't interrupt the flow with donations, but Peaceful Easy Feeling just donated $100 to the show.
Hey.
He says, all the best to you and the kids that the state is lending you for the moment. You selfish dad wanting the best for children and all that greedy stuff. Peaceful Easy Feeling, you are amazing. Thank you very much, sir, for your donation. That is outstanding. You're insane. So thank you. I appreciate you. Okay, let me continue reading this next paragraph, because this gets into her inversion of, for the safety, for the children. Homeschooling parents can, under current law, deny their children any meaningful education and subject them to abuse and neglect free from the scrutiny that helps protect children in regular schools. This is a literal argument that she wants your kids in public schools so that the government people can watch your kids to make sure that you are not abusing them, or to make sure that you're not miseducating them. I've never heard that argument for public schools before. That's the first. I've heard all kinds of arguments for public schools, but to be able to watch your parenting, haven't heard that one. That's kind of creepy.
And it's not like they're providing a meaningful education in the government school system either. Come on. I mean, this is beyond ridiculous. She's essentially, making perfect the enemy of the good here, and pretending that the government school system is that perfection. What she needs to do is contend with the fact that government schools are far from perfect. Government officials are far from perfect. They're far from all-knowing. They're less likely to have the best interest of the kids in mind. They're less likely to know about the individual needs of each individual child than that child's own parents. And she doesn't really contend with that. And like you said, I mean, it seems like she is making perfect the enemy of the good here, and essentially, pretending that if we would only get rid of homeschooling, then kids would get perfect educations and that they would never be abused. That's obviously not the case. If you transition kids from homeschool to government school, in all likelihood, they'll be more likely to be abused in some form, one way or another, either by students or the teachers themselves, and they'll be less likely to get a meaningful education. I mean, if you look at our nation's report card that just came out like a week or two ago, it was the civics, history, and geography results, and 85% of kids were not proficient in U.S. history, and 3 out of every 4 kids were not proficient in geography or civics. So she's calling for democratic education and whatnot, but that's not happening in the government schools either.
Oops.
And we live in an extremely politically, polarized society today, and 82% of kids are in government-run schools today. Does she really think that 3% of kids who are being homeschooled right now are what's causing all of our problems as it comes to civil discourse? No, I don't think so. I think it could have something to do with the government schools not teaching tolerance and not teaching kids how to debate ideas logically. I mean, look, she's teaching people reading her Arizona Law Review article not to cite any statistics and to attack people's character instead of attacking the logic of their arguments. I mean, this is what she does with Brian Ray here. I mean, she attacks his character, his funding. She doesn't attack the logic of his arguments. And maybe that's what's happening in government schools today. Maybe kids are learning that, if someone disagrees with you, they must be an evil person. And maybe that's what's leading partially to all of our intolerance that we see today and all of the political polarization that we see today as well.
Mandated reporters are key to child protection, and compulsory education has served to protect many children against maltreatment. It's also grouped them together for mass shootings. It's also given predator teachers easy access to prey. It's also done a lot to indoctrinate humans into blind trust for authority and government. It's also crushed a lot of humans' spirit of resistance to tyranny. It's done a lot of harm in and of itself. Let's see what else. Teachers and other. Go ahead.
That's the issue here, right? I mean, she only looks at one side of her policy reform and none of the unintended consequences here, none of the possible downsides of her policy proposal, which would, transition kids into government schools where that, look, again, yeah, I mean, that's a legitimate argument too, that we could say, well, some government schools have school shootings, so that means we should outlaw all government schooling or not allow kids to go to government schools. She doesn't contend with that because then she'd have to apply her reasoning to both sectors, and she doesn't really want to do that.
Teachers and other education personnel have long been responsible for a significant percentage of all reports to CPS, larger than any other group. I mean, she's making the case of why you don't want to send your kids to these indoctrination day prisons. Like,
well, another thing that's interesting that reminded me of is that how she said Brian Ray's work can't be trusted or whatever in her view, and I mean the reason is because they're positive homeschooling studies, and she doesn't like that. But she says he's politically motivated and things like that, and that he's biased in some way or another. Then she turns around and cites a study from Barbara Knox, who was recently under investigation last year for pressuring her colleagues, supposedly, to find abuse when abuse wasn't actually the case. So there's a whole article on the web about that. And she stepped down from her position at the university that was paying her $204,000 a year when she was under this investigation. So, I mean, look, as I think what you're alluding to is that CPS doesn't always get it right, and they may take away kids from families sometimes, and the families may be totally innocent, and they may do a lot of harm. Obviously, CPS does do some good, and when they do get it right, but they don't always get it right, and that's the problem I think you're highlighting.
Yeah, that's the kind of the problem I'm highlighting. Yeah, you got it. Let's see. Parents have no obligation apart from compulsory education to get their children out of the home where they can be observed by others and reported to CPS for obvious signs of maltreatment. Parents don't have to take their children to doctors, and unlike parents in many of our peer countries, they don't have to allow practitioners into their homes during their children's infancy. You mean there are countries where you are forced to allow people into your house to evaluate to make sure that your little babies are okay? Like, that's mind-blowing in and of itself. She's talking about it like that's a good thing. That's insanity.
Well, yeah, like I said earlier, I mean, like her logic behind her presumptive ban, if it's such a good idea at age 5, why not do it at age 0? It seems like she may want to do it at age 0 as well, by having government bureaucrats come into your house to make sure that you're parenting okay. But I mean, look, this claim that, kids don't get out if they're homeschooled is absolutely ridiculous. And if you look at the most recent peer-reviewed research on this in the Peabody Journal of Education, University of Oklahoma researcher Daniel Hamlin did a study on this, nationally representative sample, publicly available data at the National Center for Education Statistics, a 2019 study. They had a sample of over, I think, around 15,000 students. And even after controlling for a bunch of the, background characteristics of the students and their families and the income levels and the education levels of their parents, they found that homeschooled kids were much more likely to participate in cultural and family activities like going to a concert or going to the movies or going to a museum or going to the theater than their otherwise similar peers in the government schools. So that evidence comes in direct contrast with her argument that kids in the home aren't being exposed to mandatory reporters. I mean, that's just false, according to the evidence. They go to tons of community activities where there could be a mandatory reporter present.
Yeah, interesting. Homeschooling. Okay, but I'm just going to keep reading and raging, and you can keep counterpointing. This is good.
Yeah.
Society loses out as well. Homeschooling presents both academic concerns and democratic concerns. And I'm going to skip down a little bit. Even homeschooling parents capable of satisfying the academic function of education are not likely to be capable of satisfying the democratic function. Maybe I don't want to.
Yeah, the Democrat. What do you mean by the democratic function? Do you want us to worship the government and to vote for bigger government? Is that kind of the issue? I don't know what she means by I think what she mostly means is that if they're not getting a meaningful education in her view, then they won't be able to cast an informed vote or whatever it may be. But look, again, the government schools aren't producing good civics outcomes or U.S. history outcomes or democratic outcomes. And if you look at like the private school choice evidence, and that's where most of my research is, most of the rigorous studies on that, I think there's about 11 of them, find that school choice actually leads to better civic outcomes like tolerance of others' views, for example. And I think that has part to do with the fact that private schools may be more likely to teach better debate skills and logic and to teach you not to commit logical fallacies, because when you do commit logical fallacies and that's your line of thinking, you tend to think that your ideological opponents are just evil, and then that leads to intolerance of others' viewpoints. But if I understand someone's argument and why they're making the argument and that they have a theory behind that and they're not evil people, then I'll tolerate you as a human being, right? But we don't see a lot of that today. And I think it has a lot to do with our school system not teaching, basics of how to get into a civil discourse, and not teaching, debate skills really well.
Public schools generate these cliques, and kids are kind of taught because they have to function in these cliques of popularity that revolve around things and compete with each other and, sort of bully and troll one another. And they bring that into real life, and we get, the exact same behaviors on an adult level. I don't want that around my kids either. Thanks. All right. Homeschooling proponents make two primary arguments in defense of the current regime, one factual and one legal. The factual claim is that homeschooled children do as well or better than public school children, including on standard educational measures. The legal claim is that the parent rights are and ought to be absolute. The factual claim the factual claim is largely based on flawed advocacy research that is not true social science. We have no way of identifying, based on existing information, the total group of homeschoolers, the percentage of whose progress is assessed by some objective testing system. So why don't we address the factual claim first, and then we'll do the ethical one.
Legal one. The ethical one's easy. No one argues for absolute parental rights. This is her whole straw man that was in the title. But the factual claim, look, this is just her saying, I'm going to discount any positive evidence of homeschooling. And she does this later on. And she's right that we don't observe the whole population of homeschoolers. But that's a ridiculous, standard that she's setting for studies. No one really does research that way because it's just infeasible to get the whole population. But we can still learn from subsets of the population. And, the most rigorous research that we have does show that the evidence is positive for homeschoolers socially and academically. And there's not a lot of evidence on the abuse question, but there tends to be evidence that kids in homeschooled settings tend to be abused at lower rates than the kids in the regular schools or the government schools. She doesn't want to believe any of this, so she just says. So what she does on a few pages later is she attacks the background of the researchers instead of the research itself. And when she does attack research methods, like what I just pointed out, where she says that it's not the whole sample of homeschool population and things like that, she turns around right after that and cites research by people who were known to, who were recently under investigation for pressuring their colleagues to find abuse when it wasn't actually there. Which, that's the bigger issue here for me, though, is that she cites research with a sample size of 28 hand-picked cases of abuse and extrapolates from an extreme subset of the population to all homeschool families in general. And so she's sitting here saying that the social science in favor of homeschooling is not rigorous, but then she turns around and cites worse studies with smaller sample sizes that don't control for anything, that don't vary the outcome. Like I said earlier, it's called selection on the dependent variable. There's no, they do not, in that study of 28 people, examine or observe cases of non-abuse They only look at abuse cases. And so you can't make any causal claims from that study. It's kind of like, it's like another example of selection on the dependent variable is saying, I asked, the 10 richest people in the United States, how did they be, or like I asked them, I interviewed them all, and I found that they all took painkillers. And, because they all took painkillers, if I take painkillers tomorrow, I'll become rich, is the idea behind a selection on the dependent variable study. But of course, we don't know if it's painkillers made you more or less rich. And there's probably some other omitted variable there that caused you to be rich. Probably not painkillers. So that's kind of the, an easy way of explaining the problems of selection on the dependent variable. In education, people do it all the time where they say, look at Finland. Finland's doing so great. It must be because they pay their teachers so much. Well, we don't know the cause of Finland's better outcomes in standardized test scores. We don't know if it's that or if it's because they have a nationwide school choice program. We don't know what's causing those outcomes. So, I mean, that's the main issue here with the selection on the dependent variable. But look, I mean,
well, I'll use the same argument against her. Go ahead.
I mean, the problem is she lifts up all the negative evidence and she doesn't cite much of it. And then she just does everything she can to try to discredit and downplay or even just ignore the evidence that supports homeschooling, which the evidence that supports homeschooling that she's bashing is higher quality than the evidence that she says is a negative homeschooling study, which it says no such thing about, homeschooling being the cause of abuse. So, I mean, it's just very telling that she attacks the character of the pro homeschooling articles, but then she doesn't attack the character of the negative pro homeschooling researchers when there are actual investigations of the researchers that were against homeschooling. She didn't bring any of that up. Why? If you're going to bring up ad hominem and get into that, apply it to both sides. But I mean, what's happening here is obvious. She wants to paint her story. She has her idea that she wants. It's the presumptive ban on homeschooling. And then she's like re-engineering the study and putting in, and painting a picture with the evidence and downplaying the positive evidence and lifting up as much as she can the shoddy work and that she claims to be not in favor of homeschooling. And that's kind of the main issue here.
Yeah. So here's her argument used against her. I have no way of identifying, based on existing information, the total number of Marxists in college professorships. Therefore, I've enacted a presumptive ban on sending my family to be taught by these people. Yeah. So you can't argue with that because we have no way of identifying who they are. So, gotta be safe.
I mean, this is another logical fallacy, right? What is it called? Argument from ignorance? Argument ad ignoratum, or whatever, however you say it in Latin. If I said it in Latin, I'd be more convincing, but it's argument from ignorance. Well, we don't know if these things are happening, so we got to ban it just in case.
Yep.
No, I mean, if you don't have evidence of things happening, you can't really say it's happening. And you really shouldn't make policy based on things that might be happening. You should make policy based on, the direct evidence that you have of things happening. But I mean, and I said this earlier, let's just imagine that the evidence was not in favor of homeschooling. Let's imagine if homeschoolers scored a little bit lower on standardized tests and maybe they were abused let's just imagine in government schools, children were abused at 0.1% of the population. It's higher than that, but let's say in the homeschool environment, 0.2% of the population experienced some type of abuse. And let's say we had rigorous evidence on that. That still wouldn't be a legitimate argument to have a presumptive ban on homeschooling, because again, as I said earlier, we shouldn't punish 100% of the population for the actions of a few bad actors. Of course, we should step in, and rightly so, when we do see evidence of negative things occurring, but we shouldn't take away everybody's liberties just because it might be occurring in a subset of the population.
Okay. Also, the article says, academic success says nothing about success in terms of preparing students for civic engagement. Many homeschooled children miss out on exposure to others with different experiences and values. Most all miss out on extracurricular activities like student government. A very large proportion of homeschooling parents are ideologically committed to isolating their children from the majority of culture and indoctrinating them in views and values that are in serious conflict with that culture. I mean, some of this I'm like, yeah, but that's okay. I mean, yeah, I do want to shelter my kids at least until they're like 8 or 9. Can I have them at least until they're maybe 7 or 8 or 9 without your civic engagement and your student governments and your indoctrination? Can I get a few years on the beginning, please?
I mean, look, there's no citations here, and again, there's most and many. But like when you're saying most, you better have a citation for that, right? She says most all missed out, but you see how careful she is about saying extracurricular activities like student government. Well, of course. I mean, of course you're missing out on student government. You're not in a freaking school. And like, what are you going to do? I'm running against my sister for president of our house. Like, no,
hell no.
A student government for you and your sister. Come on. I mean,
yeah,
you can associate voluntarily in small groups, like you and your sister in your house. But like, just notice she doesn't say most all miss out on extracurricular activities like sports, because a lot of homeschool families participate in sports and club sports, and she makes sure to be really careful about how she limited that sentence to student government, because it's like, okay, well, that's not a very meaningful sentence. I mean, what if you said something like, they miss out on extracurricular activities like sports or something? Well, first I'd ask you for a citation. Second, ask if the costs out, the benefits of sports outweighed the costs of losing out on other things and their opportunity costs to participate in sport. But look, she doesn't even try to make that argument.
And these next two sentences are pretty astounding to me, because they're right next to each other, as if these things even belong in the same list. Some believe that women should be subservient to men. Others believe that race stamps some people as inferior to others. Many don't believe in the scientific method. Some look to the Bible instead as their source for understanding the world. So, like,
Bible,
sexism, racism, anti-science,
anti-religious,
and religion, all in one neat little package there for you.
Dude, she's hitting all the trigger words, right? She's just
Harvard, ladies and gentlemen.
Again, there's no evidence. There's no evidence for this. And look, I mean, why are you gonna group racist with Christians and conservatives in the same sentence? That's anti-religious bigotry and anti-religious sentiment. But I mean, look, we can say the same thing about teachers in the government school system. We say, oh, there might be some racists that are teaching in the government school system. Oh, there might be some misogynist people in the government school system. But she doesn't even say that. And look, it's just, and as I said when we started this whole thing, I mean, the whole issue is that she doesn't cite cite instances of these things happening or statistics. And then again, she just uses these words some and many over and over and over again throughout the whole article. And it's just kind of like she's painting a particular picture that she wants to paint. I can paint a similar picture, a worse picture with actual events in the government school system, but that's not scientific to do that. I mean, it would be more scientific to compare differences in these types of things occurring between sectors, but she doesn't even really try to do that. And, look, she's just really painting with a broad brush and trying to demonize homeschoolers in any way she can, apparently.
So I have three slides left that I'm going to get through one way or another. The legal claim made in defense of the current homeschooling regime is based on a dangerous idea about parent rights. That those with enormous physical and other power over infants and children should be subject to virtually no check on that power. That parents should have monopoly control over children's lives, development, and experience. That parents who are committed to beliefs and values counter to those of the larger society are entitled to bring their children up in isolation so as to help ensure that they will replicate the parents' views and lifestyle choices. Do you want to start, or shall I?
Is she arguing that minority rights don't matter? I mean, it's essentially what she's arguing, right? I mean, there are people who committed to beliefs and values, yada yada yada, that aren't. I can't even find the spot, but she says something about the majority, or larger society. The parents are committed to beliefs and values that I can't see because my box is covering it up. Something of those. of the larger society. So essentially, she's arguing that minority rights don't matter.
There's a bar on the bottom. There's the chat button. You can hide the chat window so you don't see it.
Well, I can move my picture as well, counter to those of the larger society. If not the majority of individuals are a certain religion, should they not be able to practice their religion? That seems pretty ridiculous of an argument to make.
Think about the absurdity of this position. Like, let's say that we were still around, like it was still the time of the racists and the time of the slaves, and we were required to send our kid to these schools that you taught and embraced and subjected kids to ideas of racism. She's making the case that because we don't want to keep our kids, let me rephrase. We don't want to allow people to keep their kids away from those sources of normative culture. Like, we want to force parents to include their kids in whatever is currently the normal societal cultural norms. Well, what if it's bad? Well, parents have to have the ability to protect their kids from the bad facets of cultural normativity. Like, how is that not easy to understand?
I mean, this goes along with her whole thing. This implicit assumption that the government is perfect, that they are benevolent, that whatever comes through the political process is going to be perfectly reflective of good values and virtues, and that it's going to produce perfect, educational outcomes. But look, I mean, you have to be more realistic here. I mean, like you're saying, I mean, there were times where the majority thought, the racist things and probably taught racist things, but that doesn't mean it's right. The majority isn't always right. And look, minorities should have rights as well, right? I mean, if I'm in a religious group that, for whatever reason, Elizabeth Bartholet doesn't agree with, I should be able to freely exercise that religion and include my children in that as well, and be able to exercise my religion freely with my family, even if we're not in the majority. This is just ridiculous. Applying this to any type of argument about majority versus minority. Majorities aren't always right.
Here's a personal anecdote. Now, this is my personal experience, so it's worth, all of one person's personal experience. But I think it makes this particular point very clearly. When I entered high school, junior high, high school, late elementary, junior high, high school, in those years, there was one guy who was loudly homosexual. And he was purposefully, he might have had reasons, he might have, his own damage, things done to him, whatever. He was obnoxious about it. And he would flirt with me, grab me, do things, like basically bully me with his homosexuality. Now, I had really no introduction to homosexuality back then as a kid and as a young adult. That just wasn't really part of my experience. But this one guy, I could not get away from him. He was in my class. I was forced to go to school every day. I was forced to go to this class every day. And so I grew like this hatred of the idea of gay people from this one asshole. And it took me a couple years after school to realize that it was just one asshole. Yeah. It was the only one I had ever met or known at that time. But then I think back and I'm like, my parents were very compassionate people, and they never did and they did not raise me. I should say my mother is a very compassionate person, but I was not raised to have any hatred for those people. And had I not been sent to that environment where I was forced to interact with this one obnoxious asshole, then I would never have grown that mistrust, distrust, or dislike for homosexuals like back in the day. Like, obviously, that's not me now, but that's just one example. Like, if parents want to protect their kids from being forced into situations like that might damage their views on things, why would you ever stop them from doing that? That's dangerous. It's absurd. I don't know if that made any sense, but that was my personal experience of it.
It totally makes sense. I mean, look here, like again with the straw man in this paragraph where she's essentially arguing that, proponents of homeschooling think that they should have no check on power, or that they currently don't have any check on power. Yes, you do. If you're reported for abusing your kids, then CPS comes in and does an investigation. But that's innocent until proven guilty. You don't have CPS going into 100% of families' homes and going into your dinner table each night to make sure that you're feeding your kids the correct things. But if there's suspicions, then there is a check on the power of parents. And so it's completely ridiculous for her to argue that parents there's no check on parental rights or parent power. It's just not true.
The sentence that parents...
And no one's arguing that it should be.
She believes that parents should not have monopoly control over their children's lives, development, and experience. Look, I did not create children to be tax livestock for your government. That's not why I created humans, and you have no right to force me to create new livestock for you. That's not going to happen. That's not why I'm a parent. I'm just not interested in that. I don't consent. I have monopoly control over my children's lives because I chose to have my children. I took on that responsibility. I took on the positive obligation. I did the effort. I worked to provide the resources for them, which this lady doesn't do. You have nothing to do with creating my kids. You have nothing to do with me taking on the responsibility of a parent. Neither does your government. I'm not part of your we's, your they's, your many's. I'm not part of any of your collective nonsense. I am me. I make my own decisions. These are my children. I chose to create them. They are my sole responsibility. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, she just wants the monopoly power over children to be of the government. She wants children to be property of the government. It seems. I mean, that's the idea here. That look, Patrick, if you have a kid, then that's not really your kid. It's my kid just as much as it is your kid. Is kind of the idea. But that doesn't make sense to set up a society like that, because you have way more knowledge about how to take care of your own kid, incentives to take care of your own kid, and then just care and love for the well-being of your own kid than I do. And that doesn't mean I'm a bad person. It just means, it's just makes a lot more sense for you to take care of the well-being of your own child, because again, you have better information, incentives, and just knowledge about how to do so. It's kind of hard for me to do from over here.
I mean, it's like seizing the means of human production is what is happening. Like the only step left after this, controlling education is to just actually make reproduction require a license and, go all the, like, what else? Like, okay, I create them and then I just hand them off and I walk away. I don't think so. No, the line must be drawn here and no further to little Patrick Stewart Star Trek action. Okay, so I have basically I skipped forward all the way to the end of the article with her conclusions. If you had it, is there anything else that we should go over before we kind of go through her conclusions? Or, I mean, I think we've kind of nailed it.
She talks a little bit about private schooling, and I think the viewers might think that her thoughts on private schooling are interesting.
Okay.
Other than that, I think that's about. I mean, yeah, we already talked about the anti-religious stuff. But if you just search for a whole section going on page 78, wherever that is.
Okay.
But she essentially applies logic. If you go to 78, private school reform. So her policy implication for homeschooling is to have a presumptive ban on homeschooling. But the sentence that I thought was most interesting to me here, I was talking about this with the reporter earlier. She says, moreover, it would be deeply unfair to allow those who can afford private schools to isolate their children from public values in private schools reflecting the parents' values, while denying this possibility to those unable to afford such schools. So you can read this in two ways. The way I would read it as being a proponent of and freedom and school choice, I would say, okay, well, yeah, if you're going to let rich people go to private schools, let poor people, same or low income individuals do the same thing by letting them take their kids' education dollars to the school that works best for them in the form of a voucher, a tax credit scholarship, or an education savings account. And that would allow for everyone essentially to have access to, either homeschooling or private education. But I think based on, her call for a presumptive ban on homeschooling, I feel like this is hinting at a presumptive ban on private education or a all-out ban on private education altogether. And I've seen this argument made in other places. In UK Labour Party last year they proposed, their official education proposal was to prohibit private education, to get rid of all private schools. To make it illegal to go to private schools. Oregon tried this in 1922 in the United States. The KKK and other groups pushed to outlaw private schooling in Oregon altogether. They did it until 1925. The U.S. Supreme Court thankfully found that idiotic law unconstitutional when one of the justices famously said that the child is not the mere creature of the state. So she may be hinting at a future call to have a presumptive or an all-out ban on private education altogether. And the theory here and the logic here is that, well, it's not fair if rich people can afford private schools, so we got to force them to go to the government schools. And that seems to be, if I had to pick between the two, I think that would be what she would be leaning towards, which, I would hope she'd be calling for school choice instead. I think that's the better option. But it seems like she's calling for an all-out ban on private education, since she's kind of saying, like, some of the arguments homeschooling that I've made about homeschooling, public values. So you got to do it in the public.
What does public values mean? I'm trying to decipher
my values.
What is that? Yeah, I got it. Because you could read this to be like, we don't want you rich people to be able to put your kids in private schools. We want you to sully them with the public schools like the rest of us. But I don't know that. I don't think that's what she means. Public values. What does that mean? I don't get that.
Well, maybe another thing, way that you could read this is to highlight the crap of private schools and them into de facto public schools. I mean, so she could either be calling to outlaw private schools or to make private schools essentially public schools by, requiring all the same curriculum that the government schools are using, and then maybe even not allowing religion in private schools. I think that would be obviously unconstitutional, but doesn't mean that people aren't going to make that argument.
William Fayan in the comments says majority values is what she means. Everything is democratic. Yeah, that's what that is again. Our connection is having some trouble.
I'm freezing up a little bit. Maybe you can't hear me.
It's broken audio. I make sure you have like other browser windows closed or something like that. Hopefully it'll come back.
I see.
You can go ahead and refresh if you need to.
Let me refresh the page.
Hey, audio's clean now.
Yeah.
Okay, I mean, we can, if we need to, we can leave the camera off until the internet comes back.
Refreshing.
Yeah, it's not. It's hurting. Oh, I think we're good now. Surprise! All right, yeah, I think we're good.
Yeah, I just had to refresh the page. It's a little weird, but.
All right.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Just to get back on what I was saying, I mean that other thing I thought was interesting. That she's like, well, the arguments could apply to private schools too, but this is beyond the scope of the article. And I'm just thinking, well, why'd you even bring it up? But I mean, that's what I thought was most alarming. That that one sentence that I read out could read as a possible prohibition on private education altogether, private schooling too.
Yeah, baby steps. Got to move that Overton window a little at a time, right?
Yeah. Like, hey, we'll talk about that later once I'm done with homeschooling.
Yeah, let's fix this freedom thing first, and then we'll go for the other freedom thing. All right, anything else that you'd like to cover before we head to the conclusion?
I say, head to the conclusion. I mean, we touched on a lot of the ridiculous claims that were made in the article and how they're unscientific and unbacked by the evidence, and how she doesn't even really provide any evidence to support her claims. I mean, just another example of this, if you just look up 90%, it's like the one time she only cites a statistic. Yeah, just look up 90% with a percentage sign. And let's see here. Yeah, so she argues that, so first of all, who cares if 90% of homeschoolers are Christians or conservatives? Who cares what the number is? But if you go to her footnote 33, look at what her first two citations are. If you just start going through them, the first one is a blog at the American Prospect. So I went to that. You don't have to go to that, but if you go to that and you look up the word 90%, it pops up, but there's no citation in there where they got the word 90% from. So it seems like she's getting this 90% statistic from a freaking blog, which is completely unscientific. No one would ever do that. And if you go to the second article, yeah, you can look up 90% in here too. But yeah, the second article is an Atlantic article. It's like, is this supposed to be scholarly work where you're citing your sources with just blogs and, so it's bad enough when she doesn't use statistics at all. But then it's also bad when she does use statistics, it looks like it's not really clear where these numbers are coming from. And again, even if the number was 90%, it's like, who cares if 90% of homeschoolers are Christian? Why are you trying to, demonize Christians? And why should this be a bad thing? And why should, people being Christian be a legitimate justification to ban homeschooling? It doesn't make any sense to me. So there's like multiple layers of problems with this article. This is why we've been talking for more than an hour. It's just because like every single sentence, there's an issue with it, and every single statistic and citation you can find, if someone's bored and they want to just go through this article, you'll find yourself spending hours on this if you're interested enough, and just finding so many issues with it. And I think that's why there's been so much public backlash to this article, is because of just how, anti-intellectual it is, and just how anti-freedom it is. Even if the statistics were on the side of the government, that doesn't mean that we should give up our parental rights and that we shouldn't be able to homeschool our kids in our own homes. Science doesn't grant us parental rights. Rights pre-exist government, and they certainly pre-exist these academic, quote unquote, academic studies.
Yeah. Okay, let's read kind of the last 5 paragraphs ish. Basically she's reiterating herself. We'll just go with the very conclusion. These are the last 2 paragraphs. We need a new legal regime designed to ensure that all children I feel like I need to be impersonating one of the characters from Atlas Shrugged, the bad guys, the politicians.
Yep.
We need a new legal regime designed to ensure that all children actually enjoy the rights to an adequate education and to adequate protection against child maltreatment that appear to be guaranteed by law. This would mean a radical transformation of law governing homeschooling. The homeschooling movement's claim that the current regime is justified by absolute parent rights is morally wrong and inconsistent with growing recognition worldwide that child human rights have equal status with adult human rights. It really sounds like a line out of Atlas Shrugged.
I know, come on. No one's calling for absolute parental rights. No one's calling to be able to abuse or not educate their children at all. This is just, she continues the straw man because it's easier to argue against a straw man than an actual argument. And look, homeschooling's presumptive bans aren't in most countries. Most countries have homeschooling legal. There's Germany. Germany outlawed homeschooling, and which is kind of interesting now because Germany's essentially all homeschooling now, even though it's illegal because of the coronavirus. But Germans have had homeschooling illegal on the books since 1938 during the Nazi regime. This is one of the few Nazi era laws that still exists in Germany today, and they should get rid of it. They should allow people to homeschool, as they're doing right now during the coronavirus.
So a frontal and a couple of people are asking if there's been any public backlash over this article, if her peers at Harvard have roasted her, can't believe this passed in peer review. Like, is there any backlash on this?
Oh, there's tons of backlash on this, but most of the backlash came in the form of a response to an article in Harvard Magazine. The Harvard Magazine article, and you might want to bring that up too. It's called "The Risks of Homeschooling." This is where all of the backlash started, and there was a ton. It was just, it entirely drew from the work of this paper, this 80-page paper from Elizabeth Bartholet. They pretty much just repackaged the points, pulled some quotes, interviewed her, and made it into a more publicly digestible format. And that's when the public backlashed against this, the risks of homeschooling paper in Harvard Magazine. It got so bad that Harvard Magazine closed the comments section on their website because people were responding to it and saying how ridiculous it was. And the homeschool community came out in full force in response to this. We even had, here it is. Look at the freaking house. Look at their little propaganda image in this article. They have an image of a poor, sad homeschooled child stuck in the home behind bars. Which, what type of schooling has bars? Not the home. It's the government schools that have bars to keep people in, not the home. Homeschoolers are much more likely to be playing outside, but they have this picture is completely backwards. It has you thinking that the government school kids are outside running around all day and playing, when it's the complete opposite. It's the kids that are homeschooled that have more opportunity to go outside and play by learning through play. And look, one of the books that the house is made of is the Bible. Another jab at anti-religious sentiment. And that, look at another interesting story here on this picture is that the book Arithmetic is currently spelt correctly. But the original version of this, and I have a side-by-side on my Twitter for anyone that wants to go look, but the original version of this, the book Arithmetic, was misspelled. The M-T was arithmetic. It was M-A-T. And people were, people were like, oh my God, they're trying to crap on homeschoolers and they can't even spell right themselves. And like, what a self-own. But people at first were like, well, maybe they spelt it right. Maybe they spelt it wrong on purpose because they were trying to be mean to homeschoolers by saying that they couldn't spell right. Well, they outed themselves by correcting it a few days later and essentially admitting, we got it wrong first. That was not an intentional jab at homeschoolers. That was a self-own. Like, if you're going to come out swinging to ban homeschooling because of miseducation and educational maltreatment, as they say in the article, you better make sure you're spelling words right in your propaganda piece attacking homeschooling. That's great. So, internet had a field day with that, and they caved in and changed they closed the comments off because people were responding. If you just look up the risk of homeschooling on news reports or anything, it'll take you pages and pages to get to that actual article. You'll see mostly a bunch of response pieces, negative response pieces to this propaganda hit piece against homeschooling. And they also had a June conference organized by Elizabeth Bartholet and James Dwyer. It was supposed to come up in June. We organized a response conference for the Harvard Kennedy School. It organized a response conference with myself and 5 other speakers to make the pro homeschooling argument. And we just did that a few days ago on Friday, May 1st. And I can share the link with whoever in the comments in a second. It's called the Disinformation Campaign Against Homeschooling, where we take on a lot of Elizabeth Bartholet's arguments with 7 total speakers that are pro-homeschooling speakers, including people like Peter Gray and Carrie McDonald. So I was honored to be included with other great minds on the topic of homeschooling, defending the right to educate your own children at home. So, that was one of the biggest responses. We organized that whole conference. It was essentially looked like Harvard going to war with itself. You had you had the law school setting up this explicitly anti-homeschooling conference. In the description, they said the focus will be on the problems of educational maltreatment and child abuse that far too often falls under the guise of homeschooling, in their words. I'm paraphrasing, but that was about right what they said. And so it was explicitly anti-homeschooling. We responded with our pro-homeschooling conference. And then it turns out the information came out just a few days ago publicly that the anti-homeschooling conference completely canceled for the year. They said it was because of COVID-19. We were kind of musing that it's because they heard our great arguments the other day and they knew they couldn't handle it and they knew they better quit. We were just kind of musing that might have been the case, but I saw some evidence that they might have had this planned to be canceled even before our event came up. But there's been a lot of backlash for weeks over this, anti-homeschooling event and the propaganda hit piece that came out in the Harvard Magazine article. So there was a lot of pushback. But, look, even with coronavirus, they could have still done the event virtually and they could have made it open to the public like we did. We made ours open to everyone. We allowed anyone to sign in and watch because we knew that we had good ideas on our side. The Harvard Law School's event was completely closed off to the public, completely secretive. You had to get an invite to go. None of my pro-homeschooling colleagues that I know of, that I've talked to, and I have a pretty big network of homeschoolers and homeschool supporters and school choice supporters. None of them got any invites to this invite-only conference that was anti-homeschooling. So it seemed like a pretty big echo chamber that was supposed to be held. And that's probably why they didn't want to make it a Zoom conference or a video call and make it available publicly for everyone to hear.
Somebody in the comments, and I don't know who this is, so you're welcome to not discuss it if you'd like not to. Sandra Helmsley says, "Can you guys talk about the man that makes me shudder, James Dwyer?" I don't know who that is, so maybe you can tell me.
Yeah, and I read a quote out from him a little earlier, but he co-organized the conference, and I'm going to bring it up just a second because I'm pretty quick at bringing this stuff up on my computer. But on my Twitter, I tweeted out a video of that summarizes his ideas, and maybe I could send this to you. But if you could just look up on Twitter at DeAngelis Corey James Dwyer, the first thing that pops up is this video I shared that's been viewed over 500,000 times on YouTube. But he was a co-organizer of this conference, and I'm reading it now. His quote is, "The reason parent-child relationships exist is because the state confers legal parenthood." He adds on a little later that it is the state that is empowering parents to do anything at all with children. So essentially implying that, we all belong to the government. Our children aren't ours. The children, we can only do anything with our children because the government gives us permission, is his argument.
Okay, so I'm going to read this last paragraph, and then I'm probably going to take myself full screen because I don't want you to be associated with what I'm about to say unless you choose to be.
Okay, yeah, maybe take me off.
So the last paragraph of this article says, "The new legal regime should impose a presumptive ban on homeschooling, allowing an exception for parents who can satisfy a burden of justification. And it should impose significant restrictions on any homeschooling allowed under this exception." So I'll let Corey give any final thoughts and response in a moment, but I wanted to get this out. And this is not, I'm not associated with Corey. Corey is not endorsing what I'm about to say. This is me speaking to you as an activist, as a voluntarist. People have asked me for the past year and a half about the Boogaloo memes and about how serious I think they are and about when I think it would be time for some kind of armed resistance. And I have told them at every step of the way, it's a bad idea. It's a bad idea to be the first one to do violence. But let me tell you, if you come for my children, I will come for you. My children are my activism in the world. They are why I do everything I do. This channel, Anarchast, my Discord server, everything you've seen me do in the past 7 years is done for my children to make this world a better place for them. And if you come for my children, you have crossed my line. That is my line. No, sorry. Back to the show. Sorry about that. I didn't want you associated with that. I just want people to know, because they always ask me about, like, where's the line? That is it for me. You stay away from my children. You are treading in dangerous waters. Okay. Do you have any final thoughts for us, Corey?
Yeah, I just want to point out, I mean, look, we've talked about this, throughout the whole time, but, there's a few layers of issues with this article, and I just want to kind of reiterate those. One is that Elizabeth Bartholet uses the word some or many 210 times throughout this article. It's an 80-page article. My most recent article is about 72 pages, and it uses the word some or many 4 times. And I'm embarrassed myself to say that I use some or many more than 0 times. I use it 4 times, which I try to avoid. But look, her article, similar length, 210 times, that kind of summarizes the main issue with this article, that she doesn't use statistics to back up her claims. She uses fear-mongering. She uses extreme cases to extrapolate she applies extreme cases to the entire population of homeschoolers, essentially arguing that if one homeschool family does something bad, then all homeschoolers are evil people who don't want to educate their kids in the homes, and that they just want to use homeschooling as a shelter for child abuse. That's what she wants you to believe. And she doesn't use, very much intellectual honesty in doing so, since she uses the word some or many so many times, and doesn't really use statistics to back up her claims. That's the main issue. The second issue is that she compares homeschooling essentially to nirvana or heaven or perfection, and she should instead, if she wanted to have a ideologically pure and fair conversation about this issue, she should be comparing homeschooling to the realistic alternative to homeschooling, which is government schooling, because 82% of kids are attending government schools in the United States today, and we have tons of instances of negative socialization going on in schools, such as fighting and bullying and drug activity and gang activity that go on in the government school system, and these are real life alternatives to homeschooling. So if you make perfect the enemy of the good with homeschooling, you could essentially pressure or force, either way, more children to be abused at higher rates and to receive worse educations if you don't contend with the fact that government schools are not perfect. So that's the second layer of the issue with her article. The third layer of the issue is that when she does come up and cite some evidence, what she mostly does is try to discredit all the positive evidence for homeschooling and try to uplift the negative evidence that she claims is against homeschooling in any way that she can. And she does so by committing ad hominem to the pro-homeschooling researchers, and she doesn't bring that same energy to the anti-homeschooling researchers who have themselves been under investigation for allegedly pressuring their colleagues to find abuse when abuse didn't actually occur in the home. And then she cites statistics, or when she does cite studies, they tend not to be rigorous. For example, she cites one study based on only 28 extreme cases of abuse, where the authors themselves say that this is not representative of the population and that you shouldn't do statistical tests on these data. It doesn't stop Elizabeth Bartholet from citing that in trying to claim that there's a lot of abuse going on with homeschooling families, and that's completely irresponsible for her to do so. And then again, further on, she also appeals to anti-religious bigotry is another big issue. And when she does that, she claims statistics that are backed up by opinion pieces, not scientific research. And then even if her statistics were true, families have the First Amendment right to freely exercise their religions, even if Ivy League elites don't like the fact that some homeschoolers are Christians or conservatives and have those values. It's none of her business that they're choosing to homeschool their children, because we have that First Amendment right in the United States. Even though I'm not a religious person myself, I understand that we all have that right. And then also, even if the scientific evidence, and I think this is probably the most important part, that even if the scientific evidence was not in favor of homeschooling, even if we did find that homeschoolers for whatever reason, scored a little lower on the standardized test, or if they didn't graduate from high school as high of rates, even though all this evidence suggests the opposite. It suggests that the evidence is positive for homeschooling, and homeschoolers tend to fare better academically and socially than their otherwise similar peers in the government schools. Even if the evidence wasn't positive, that wouldn't mean that a presumptive ban on homeschooling is justified, because that would be akin to saying that we should all be guilty until proven innocent. If some other family is not providing a meaningful education to their child, and if that's, a minority of the population, that I should not be punished for that. And I should still be able to educate my children, and I shouldn't be treated as if I'm guilty when I'm providing my kids with an excellent education. So again, our parental rights do not hinge on science. Our parental rights do not come from the government. Our rights pre-exist government, and science isn't what grants us these rights. Instead, the government should have the burden of proof of proving that there's some evidence of us doing anything wrong. And that burden of proof should always be on the government, not individuals in society. And then lastly, just think about the implications of her ban as it relates to other areas of our lives that we would just think would be completely ridiculous. The logic behind the presumptive ban is that Elizabeth Bartholet believes that if you have nothing to hide, then you should have no problem proving your innocence to the government. But the first issue with that is I don't trust the government to know what education ought to look like. Are they going to tell me that if I don't focus and teach to the test, that's not a meaningful education? I don't think that's actually a meaningful education. I don't trust the government bureaucrats to get something as simple as food right. They didn't get the food pyramid right. And so I don't trust them to similarly get something as complicated as education right for every single individual child. But then again, let's just think about how this presumptive ban could apply to other areas. If you're, should we be guilty until proven innocent? That essentially, you can essentially get rid of the Fourth and Fifth Amendment if that was the case, because people could argue that, well, if you have nothing to hide, then you should be all A-okay with the government coming in without a warrant and checking in on you whenever they want. And with the Fifth Amendment, if you have nothing to hide, well, then the argument goes that, well, then you should not have a right to remain silent, because if you have nothing to hide, is the argument, then you should just talk. And there's obvious problems with getting rid of both of those amendments that I don't have time to go over today. But then also, if it's a good idea to have a presumptive ban on homeschooling because of the potential for abuse at age 5 through 18, well, then if that's a justified action of government, well, then should we also send our kids to the government at age 0? Why is it any different from between the ages 0 and 5? Well, I think it's because most people would think it would be absolutely ridiculous to require all families to send their kids to the government at age 0. But that's the same logic that's applied from Elizabeth Bartholet's ban. And then again, there's potential for abuse happening in our lives even after we become adults at age 18. We enter into relationships with people, and sometimes couples could have the potential for abuse, and that does happen in certain circumstances. But that does not mean that we should all be required to go to government mandated counseling. We shouldn't have to pay government counselors each week because there is the potential for abuse. We shouldn't have to prove our innocence in our relationships, just like we shouldn't have to do that with homeschooling as well. I think most people would think that would be ridiculous. Other areas of life with kids, for food, for example. We all want kids to have a healthy, meaningful life and to eat healthy foods, but everyone would think it would be ridiculous to apply Bartholet's logic to from homeschooling to food, in that it would be that, if you have nothing to hide, then you should be A-okay with a government bureaucrat coming into your house each night and eating dinner with you, because they have to check and make sure you're feeding your kids a meaningful, healthy meal. And I'm never arguing, and no one else, I think, in support of homeschooling is arguing that parents should be able to abuse their kids or not feed their kids, meaningful, healthy meals. We're just arguing that the burden of proof should be on the government. And if there is evidence of wrongdoing, then the government should step in to intervene if parents are abusing their children or if parents are not feeding their children. Of course, the government should step in, but we should not punish 100% of the population for the actions of some bad actors. think you're muted, Patrick. I think I went too long.
No.
You muted yourself. You were talking to your friends over there.
No. I didn't want to interrupt you. I was saying that was much more calmly and politely said than what I had to say. And I appreciate your thorough analysis on this topic and on this document and on this absurdity. I guess before we go, I just want to point people to other cool things that you've done. You wrote an article. You've done a lot of thought and research on school choice, and you wrote an article that I thought was really cool on taking the same arguments that you took or that you created or that you argue you use for school choice to police choice. So there's an article on police choice, and if you search this channel, Disenthrall, we have for our book club, we have a book club playlist, and I did a reading of his article on police choice, and it's very fascinating to try and take these arguments that you can couch with normal people can understand these school choice arguments and use them for police choice, and that's usually a topic that's reserved for discussions of voluntarism and anarcho-capitalism, right? But a lot of the arguments work quite well for police choice. So I would advise any of you to go check out either the book club video where we read it, or you can go find his article. I think it's linked on Mises.org, right? So if you could just tell us where we can find you on your socials, tell people where they can find your work.
Yeah, find me on Twitter. It's at DeAngelis Corey. It's just my last name and then my first name. But then you can also find me at the Reason Foundation website. So if you just Google Corey DeAngelis Reason Foundation, you'll find me there. But you can also find my work at the Cato Institute website. Just Google Corey DeAngelis Cato or Corey DeAngelis Cato Institute, any of those three places. You can find a bunch of my work. My Twitter messages are open. So if you want to contact me about any speaking engagements, or if you just have any thoughts to share with me, you can message me on Twitter as well at DeAngelis Corey.
All right, man. I guess you gave your closing thoughts, but I think this was a great show. I think we utterly destroyed that article from both a moral and a statistical standpoint. Another really good chat with you, sir. Thanks for being on the show.
Yeah, thanks for talking with me. I'll talk to you later.
All right, guys. Thanks for watching. Thanks for spending your time with us. Great comments in the chat, and I'll be on Discord in probably 30 minutes from now. So if you want to join us on our Disenthrall Discord server, the address is at the top. Go to disenthrall.me/platforms. There's a link to our Discord server. You can join in, have a voice conversation with us. Aside from that, I will see you guys next time.